Hello and welcome to my video all about how to make your own lined placemats. This is a really simple project and it's basically an exercise in making mitred corners, which comes in handy in all sorts of sewing projects. It's perfect for beginners and really allows you to personalise your dining table. For this project you're going to need some fabric. I picked up a large piece of fabric in the remnants bin at IKEA for just £3.50 and it's got a really cool vegetable pattern all over. For each placemat I needed a piece that was 18.5 by 13.5 inches. So obviously the more placemats you need, the more fabric you're going to need. I used medium weight home decor fabric. You want it to be easily washable and fairly robust, so woven cotton is a good choice. I wouldn't use a knit fabric or anything that stretches. And I wouldn't use something like linen either because that does wrinkle easily. It's an optional step, but if you want to add a lining to your placemats, you're going to need some lining fabric. I just used some cheap red polycotton that was very lightweight. You'll also need a fabric pen, a metal ruler, preferably 1 metre long, but 12 inches or 30 centimetres is absolutely fine as well. A sewing machine and thread that matches the fabric. It is possible to hand sew the placemats, but it would take a lot longer. You'll also need sewing pins, fabric scissors, a rotary cutter and cutting mat if you have them, and an iron and ironing board. The following instructions are for making one placemat, so simply repeat the following steps for each placemat you want to make. Okay, so the first step is to wash and iron your fabrics. This is an important step because the fabrics might shrink a little because it's the first wash, and also you want to iron them to make sure they're crease free. You then draw out a rectangle with your fabric pen that measures 18.5 inches by 13.5 inches. You want to draw this rectangle close to the edge of your fabric piece just to minimise wastage. This particular rectangle size will create a finished placemat approximately 16 inches by 11 inches. Feel free to alter these measurements depending on how big you want your placemats to be. I used my 1 metre metal ruler and my fabric pen to draw the rectangle onto the fabric. I used the grain of the fabric and the selvage edge to make sure that all the corners were at right angles and I wasn't drawing it wonky. You can also use something like a wide quilting ruler or a set square to make sure all of the corners are right angles. And then all you need to do is cut out that rectangle shape. I put the fabric on a cutting mat and used a rotary cutter to cut along the lines. I used the rotary cutter alongside a metal ruler to make sure that I kept those cuts nice and straight. If you don't have a rotary cutter, feel free to use fabric scissors instead. Once you've cut out that rectangle, you need to use your fabric pen to mark 2 points at each of the corners on the back of the fabric. You need to make 2 marks on each of the fabric edges, so 8 marks altogether. Each mark needs to be 2 inches from a corner. You then need to fold each of the fabric edges inwards so that the edges line up with the marks you've just made, i.e. you fold over each fabric edge by 1 inch. You then press these folds with an iron. Look up the heat settings recommended for the fabric you're using if you're unsure. If, like me, you're using cotton, then you should be able to use high heat and steam to get crisp folds. Once you've done that, you need to draw straight lines to join up the 2-inch marks at each corner. So take your fabric pen and ruler and draw a straight line between the 2-inch marks at each corner. These lines should pass through the point where the pressed folds intersect. Once you've drawn that diagonal line at each corner, you need to fold 1/4 inch of the fabric edges inwards and press with an iron. Once you've done that, you should have folds that are 1/4 of an inch and 1 inch away from the edge, all the way around the fabric. We're now going to create the mitered corners, which give a professional look to your project. So you take one corner and you fold it in half, so that the right sides of the fabric are together. You need to make sure that you turn the 1/4 inch fold outwards, so that you can see the front of the fabric around the edge of the point, as shown here. Make sure the corner is symmetrical by checking that the fabric edges line up. Then use a sewing pin to hold the fabric in place and repeat this for all of the corners. You then need to take the placemat over to the sewing machine and sew along the fabric pen line at each corner. Once you put the presser foot onto the fabric to begin sewing, you can remove the sewing pin so that you don't sew over it accidentally. The presser foot should hold the fabric in place instead. So you simply sew over that fabric pen line and use a short straight stitch. I used a 2.5mm stitch length, which was the default length on my machine, and then cut off the excess thread. We then need to remove the excess fabric at each corner to make sure that the corners look neat and not bulky. We do this by making 2 cuts with the fabric scissors. First, we cut the fabric from the pointed corner inwards. You want to make the triangular point have more equal length sides. So I'll just show you what I mean. I'm just going to cut this fabric off, making sure I stay about 1/8 of an inch from the stitch line, and you can see here that the resulting triangle has sides of a more equal length. You don't have to be accurate doing this, so don't worry. Just make sure that you don't cut through the stitched line. That's the most important thing. The second cut is going to be parallel to the stitched line, about 1/4 of an inch away from it. So you simply cut parallel to the stitch line, like so, and that removes the rest of the excess fabric at that corner. And then you repeat this for all of the other corners. You then turn all of the corners inside out, or rather the right side out. Make sure the corners are completely turned out so that they have a nice crisp point, and they are all right angles. You can press the corners with an iron if you wish. It's completely optional, but if you want to add a backing or lining to your placemat, you now need to cut out a rectangle from that fabric that is just smaller than the placemat size. So in other words, you need to cut out a rectangle of lining fabric that is about 1/4 of an inch narrower and 1/4 of an inch shorter than your finished placemat size. Then you simply slip that fabric, right side out, underneath the folded over fabric edges of your placemat. And try and keep it symmetrical so that it's evenly spaced away from the placemat edges. Make sure the lining sits completely flat and is crease free. You then use sewing pins at the corners to hold the lining and the fabric together in the correct position. This next step you're going to need to do whether you've used lining or not. And that step is to add a straight stitch all the way around your placemat. So I simply use the same straight stitch as I did before, 2.5mm long, to top stitch all the way around. I started at one corner, back stitched to secure the thread, and then sewed all the way around, 3/4 of an inch away from the edge. Make sure to take the sewing pins out as you sew. This will create a stitch line close to the inside edges of the hems on the underside of the placemat, as you can see here. Just as a final step, you can then iron the placemat to finish. And that's it, you've now made one placemat. You can of course repeat all of these steps again to make as many placemats as you want. I really hope you've enjoyed this project, and thank you very much for watching.